about that. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Carrie Tirado-Brayman, Director of the Gender Institute and Professor of English. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Feminist Research Alliance workshop. Before we turn to introducing our speaker today, I would like to begin by acknowledging the land upon which the University of Buffalo operates, which is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we're grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. Hilary Vandenbark is currently a graduate assistant to the Gender Institute, where she has been doing an amazing job for the past 2 years. She is the host of the Gender Matters podcast. She created and has facilitated the wonderful Black Lives Matter book club, which just ended last week. And she oversaw the dissertation writing group through COVID, and 3 members are defending their dissertations in the near future. In 2019, she was a Women in Policy Fellow at the Center for Women in Government and Civil Society at SUNY Albany. The fellowship placed her as a policy consultant at the New York Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. Hilary previously interned at the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women, authoring a report on women in elected office in Erie County history. Hilary hopes to continue working in government policy on sexual and gender-based violence upon completing her dissertation, which examines the role of government in addressing sexual violence through a case study of the legislative process and implementation of New York's Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights Act of 2018. Hilary will be sharing a chapter from her dissertation today entitled Ally or Adversary, Rethinking Feminist Relationships with the State Post MeToo. And I can't think of a better talk to recognize that April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So thank you so much, Hilary, for agreeing to present your dissertation, and we're very much looking forward to it. So I'll hand it over to you.
All right, well, first of all, thank you so much, Carrie, for the warm introduction and the opportunity to share some of my dissertation research. I'm very honored to be included in the Feminist Research Alliance series, and I'm so excited to hear Melinda Lemke's work on feminist critical policy analysis next month. I also want to thank Gwen Thomas, Corinne Martirosian, and Teresa McCarthy for serving on my committee and their invaluable insights into my dissertation. Thank you all for joining us. I am in the middle of revising the dissertation right now, which we all know is a fun process. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion afterward and hearing your ideas and questions. So my research focuses on state responses to sexual violence and under what conditions those responses change. So I thought it might be helpful to offer a quick outline of my talk today. Because some of it is very technical and I don't want to lose some of the bigger questions that we're going to be asking when we get into kind of the policy trenches, as it were. So I'm going to start by prefacing the language I'll be using throughout, and I'll talk a little bit more about my background and how it informs my research. Then I'll discuss the goals and guiding questions of my dissertation, as well as the theoretical framework for answering these questions to build my argument. I offer a brief discussion of the MeToo movement and how it has shifted the cultural understanding of sexual violence and harassment, such that the state must take notice. Next, I'll provide a detailed history of the Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights, the main focus of my research, and an examination of political performances in the context of New York political culture. I'll conclude by thinking about what might be next for survivors as a political bloc. So to my quick note on language, throughout the presentation, I will use survivor and victim fairly interchangeably. There are strong debates about which word is best and in which context that I can talk more about in the Q&A, but I just wanted to make a note of it at the beginning. And second, I'll try to differentiate between the state as a biopolitical power structure, or the big state, and the small s state of mid-level governance. Though most of this talk focuses on the latter, because that is where effective sexual assault policy happens, even though feminist scholarship tends to focus on the former. My work also focuses on the bureaucratic and legislative side of the state, whereas most research on sexual assault focuses on the courts and criminal justice system writ large. So I also wanted to talk about my background in policy work before getting to the heart of my argument, because these experiences inform my thinking on the state, its roles, and its limitations. As Carrie mentioned, in 2019, I was a Women in Public Policy Fellow at SUNY Albany, a 6-month program during which we learn about the public policy processes, social change theories, and develop leadership skills while working in government agencies or nonprofits. I served as a housing and economic security policy consultant at the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, which will soon be expanded to the New York State Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence. My work allowed me to meet with national and state leaders on housing and economic stability, meet with DV service providers, get training on sexual and domestic violence in queer and BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. The fellowship provided opportunities to observe interagency committee meetings on gender-based violence, attend a bicameral hearing on sexual harassment within the legislature, participate in lobby days, annual summits on poverty and domestic violence, and attend a restorative justice sexual assault training from the amazing Indigenous anti-violence organization, the Seven Dancers Coalition. So these are some photos of my cohort, and the top left photo is of my supervisors and myself. And then the bottom left photo is members of my cohort with Governor Andrew CUOMO at the Governor's Mansion for an exclusive party celebrating the passage and signing of the Reproductive Health Act on the anniversary of Roe v. Wade in 2019. And so while I won't get to it here, we can certainly talk about the current allegations of sexual misconduct against CUOMO during the Q&A and what it means to hold state actors accountable. So I wanted to share this background with you because these experiences really showed me how tedious, technical, and complex policy work really is, especially when you have different state actors trying to tackle wide-reaching and intersectional issues. So the goal of my dissertation and talk today is to examine the interaction between social movements, state actors, culture shifts, and policy changes or outcomes through a case study on the 2018 New York Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights Act. I define a state actor as any person or institution that can act on state authority or change state policy. The most common state actors represented in my talk today are lawmakers, the governor, and some bureaucrats charged with implementing policy changes mandated by the legislature. So in some ways, the title of my talk is a bit of a misnomer because I'm less interested in the theoretical determination of the role of the biopolitical state or debates on whether the state is helpful or harmful, but rather to think about under what circumstances does the small s state shift its policies regarding sexual assault? How do feminist activists leverage the current climate to exact political commitments from state actors? And in turn, how do these state actors leverage the climate to enhance their political performances of allyship or responsiveness to their constituents? So in order to answer these questions, I utilize Sharon Ray's political performance framework because it takes into account the role of culture, timing or context, political performance, and reception in making policy changes. Ray defines political performance as, quote, those performances that seek to communicate to an audience meaning-making related to state institutions, politics, and discourses, end quote. Ray identifies two axes of political performance. Performance, which focuses on how state actors, particularly lawmakers, position themselves as representing the people, and reception, or whether constituents and stakeholders believe these performances and ascribe the intended meaning to the state actors' actions. So this framework is really useful in examining the New York State Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights because my data consists of press conferences, press releases, bill drafts, media coverage, The governor's 2018 inaugural women's agenda, the 2018 budget bill, which I'll explain later, and finally interviews with legislators or their staffers and advocates. Each of these represent particular types of political performances and opportunities for reception, which I examine using discourse analysis methods. I build on Ray's framework to argue that advocates are most successful when they pursue narrow policy changes that pose little risk and high reward for state actors seeking to perform allyship and responsiveness within a changing social landscape. The Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights Act is a rare, unanimous, and bipartisan legislative effort. Changes made in the legislation do not represent a massive overhaul of public policy, yet signal to survivors that the state will take care of you and preserve your right to a day in court. So this creates little risk associated with supporting the legislation and a high political performance reward in the context of the MeToo movement that exploded across the country just a few months prior to the 2018 legislative session. MeToo movements in many ways provides the backdrop of the story of this legislation. Started in 2006 by Tarana Burke as a movement to help survivors heal and build solidarity, especially for Black women. It went viral in fall 2017 when the allegations against movie mogul Harvey Weinstein finally gained traction and credibility. MeToo brought down notable politicians such as New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, but it also created opportunities for others to perform political allyship, such as Kamala Harris in the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. MeToo movement pressure also generated some fraught political performances, most notably Susan Collins, her speech defending her confirmation vote of Kavanaugh while voicing her support for the MeToo movement. One of my study participants called the MeToo movement a disinfectant that will disinfect powerful institutions that have previously protected themselves. And another stated that it made sexual violence harder to ignore for legislators and easier for activists to talk about. So I'll speak more on the process of passing the Bill of Rights legislation in New York and the impact of the MeToo movement in a moment. But first I want to provide a history of the legislation. This bill has a somewhat unusual trajectory of having been a state bill in Massachusetts, then a federal bill, and now spreading back down through the states. The state bill, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, 12 US states have some form of a Victims' Bill of Rights. RISE, which Amanda Wen founded, has also lobbied the United Nations to pass a resolution on the rights of survivors, although we know that that would largely be symbolic, as most UN resolutions tend to be. So in 2013, Harvard student Amanda Wen was sexually assaulted, had a sexual assault forensic examination, commonly known as a rape kit, but wasn't ready to press charges. She later discovered that under Massachusetts law, the onus was on the victim to petition police to maintain a rape kit every 6 months or it would be destroyed. In 2014, she founded RISE, an organization dedicated to drafting and passing a Bill of Rights for survivors in every state and at the federal level. So in 2016, Senator Chuck Grassley and Representatives Mimi Walters and Zoe Lofgren introduced the Federal Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights to extend the storage of rape kits to 20 years and inform victims of their rights. By the end of September, it became only the 21st piece of legislation to pass unanimously in both bicameral bodies in American history. Former President Obama signed the bill into law on October 7th, 2016. Wen testified before Congress twice in relation to this legislation, with others such as actors Evan Rachel Wood before the House and Terry Crews before the Senate. Wen has also testified before Congress in relation to the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. It's important to note, however, that federal legislation only affects federal rape cases. However, the majority of rape cases are adjudicated in state courts, and each state has different practices in relation to rape kits and victims' rights. This is why Wen asserts in her congressional testimonies that the federal level legislation is largely symbolic and is, quote, a model for states to follow, end quote. RISE continues to work with survivors to bring a Bill of Rights into existence in all 50 states because, quote, justice shouldn't depend on geography, end quote. Both these hearings include powerful political performances across the aisle, with both Democrats and Republicans invoking the MeToo movement explosion in their statements and questions. Republican political performances gravitated toward a law and order narrative, and Democrats tended to affirm sexual violence as a women's rights issue. Both of these are problematic for reasons we can discuss later, but now I'd like to get to the heart of my dissertation, which is the small s state level case study of the policy process in New York to pass and implement the 2018 Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights Act. So the bill was championed by Senator Kemp Hannon, then chair of the Senate Health Committee, and Arabella Simotas, an assembly member with a reputation for common sense, toughness, and an advocate for women's health and safety issues. RISE activist Abby Haglish worked with Mariska Hargitay's Joyful Heart Foundation to help draft the bill and advocate for the legislation during lobby days. In 2017, the bill stalled in committee, but not because of a lack of support, but because of inconsistencies with New York's health code. When I was doing my interviews, I was hoping for something sexy, like it had opposition, and then the Me Too movement happened, and suddenly it had support. But unfortunately, policy work is not that sexy very often. And so it did just come down to making the language consistent with other parts of the health code. So in January 2018, Governor CUOMO included the Bill of Rights as one of the top safety priorities in his inaugural Women's Agenda, a new component of the State Address. The bill passed unanimously in June of 2018, and CUOMO signed it in December. The bill took effect in June 2019, and this one-year delay was intended to give the affected agencies, the Department of Health, the Office of Victim Services, and the Department of Criminal Justice Services, time to develop regulations and equip hospitals with the necessary storage. So what does the Bill of Rights actually do? So it extends the storage mandate for unassigned safe kits from 30 days, the shortest window in the country, to 20 years. Unassigned means the kit is not yet tied to a criminal investigation, meaning that previously survivors only had 30 days to decide whether to press charges and were seldom alerted to the shortness of the window. It mandates that victims receive verbal and written notice of their rights wherever they first interact with the system, be it in the hospital, with law enforcement, or district attorney's offices. These rights include the right to have a crisis counselor or advocate present during an exam or interview, the right to stop the exam or interview at any point, the right to be notified in advance of scheduled rape kit destruction, and the right to know the outcome of any testing on the kit, the right to know the storage location of the kit, and the right to not be billed for the exam. The bill also provides funding for hospitals to increase their storage capacity to handle the higher volume and longer storage time. So now that we've learned the history of the Survivors' Bill of Rights and what it does in New York State, specifically, I want to shift gears into my analysis of the legislative policy process as political performance. So to do this, it's important to understand the political culture of New York. Nationally, New York has a reputation for being quite progressive, but despite this reputation, New York is deeply divided internally along several fault lines, including party and geography. As you can see in this graphic depicting the 2020 presidential election results, which more or less maps onto the state level, with downstate and more populous areas leaning Democrat and more rural areas generally supporting Republicans. In New York, the governor's office is quite powerful under the New York Constitution and can set the legislative agenda through the state of the state, an annual overview of current issues and priorities. The governor also drives the budget agenda, an important policy mechanism because it directs the use of funds. This means that the governor's policy priorities can often hide within the budget allocations and directives for use. For instance, in the 2018 budget bill, the governor directed funds for the storage of rape kits to 5 years and included directives that victims be informed about what happens to the kits. The legislature itself was quite starkly divided until after the 2018 elections, in which Democrats won control of the Senate. Before that, the bodies were so partisan that a bill could easily pass in one house just to die on arrival in the other. So for the time frame that I'm discussing here, the Assembly was controlled by Democrats and the Senate was controlled by Republicans. And in fact, bipartisanship was one of the main themes of state actors' political performances related to this legislation. So in August 2017, CUOMO established the New York State Council on Women and Girls in response to the Trump administration dismantling the Obama-era federal council. By January 2018, the council issued its first report and recommendations, which comprised the first women's agenda, with many of those recommendations spurred by the MeToo movement regarding sexual harassment and workplace protections. By establishing the council and women's agenda, CUOMO reinforces New York's reputation as progressive and positions himself as a national opposition player to President Trump, which we see him do again during the COVID-19 pandemic. When discussing the Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights, the report states, quote, "The governor's proposed legislation better reflects previous action taking to lift the statute of limitation on rape and the overwhelming evidence showing rape kits help identify serial rapists. This proposal will also protect the rights of sexual assault victims while maintaining their right to choose when to report the crime to law enforcement and ensures that their evidence be maintained with integrity until they choose to have the kit tested," end quote. So here the governor seeks to take credit for the legislation, even though Simotas and Hannon had introduced it in the prior cycle of 2017. He also signals his allyship to survivors and their rights, while also noting the law and order aspect of identifying serial rapists and working with law enforcement. The annual Women's Agenda is one political performance platform, but far more common are press conferences and press releases. On February 13, 2018, Senator Kemp Hannon, the sponsor of the bill, called a press conference to discuss it. The press conference featured Arabella Simotas, the sponsor in the Assembly, survivor and RISE member Abby Haglish, Ilse Knecht of the Joyful Heart Foundation, a charity lobbying for legislative reform nationwide on issues related to sexual assault, and Assembly member and chair of the Assembly Health Committee, Dick Godfrey, as well as some technical policy wonks. While the entire 35-minute press conference is a rich text of political performances, I want to focus on quotes from the two sponsors and the two advocates. So Simotas opens her remarks by thanking Senator Hannon for his bipartisanship, saying, quote, "Thank you for partnering with me to make sure that all rape survivors are heard and that the evidence that is collected from their bodies is not destroyed," end quote. In addition to bipartisan political theater in a deeply partisan state, Simotas harkens back to the MeToo movement when she references the importance of listening to survivors. After Simotas, Hannon returns to the podium to introduce Abby Haglish. Quote, "I'd like to ask that Abby Haglish come forward. She has dual roles. She is both a survivor of the attack of rape and she is a leader in New York RISE and can explain a little bit about what she's gone through and why she's in favor of our legislation," end quote. Abby proceeds to talk for about 5 minutes, offering powerful testimony of her experience of having been assaulted and later learning her kit had been discarded. As she speaks, Hannon listens intently behind her and at one point wipes a tear from his eyes. While the emotion is clearly genuine, it also carries value in a political performance of listening to victims and responding to their needs. As you can see from the title card image here, Hannon is also hashtagging his press conference with hashtag protecting rape victims, again gravitating towards a narrative of protection and access to justice and referencing the viral MeToo hashtag. So during the press conference, advocates and activists applied movement pressure on legislators not present, as well as signaled their positive reception of Simotis and Hannon's political performances. Rise activist Aggie Haglish opens her statement with, quote, "I want to applaud Senator Hannon and the other legislators here for being champions of this legislation. On behalf of the millions of survivors in New York State, thank you," end quote. And closes her statement with, quote, "The least that New York can do is to preserve our evidence until we are ready," end quote. So in addition to positively receiving the sponsors' performances, she continues to leverage the 6.8 million survivors in New York, a significant population, and she makes a particular claim on the responsibility of the state to provide for victims. Ilse Knecht also leverages New York's progressive reputation and national stature in favor of the bill, saying, quote, "These reforms would make New York a leader and serve as an example to the rest of the states," end quote. Knecht thus minimizes the risks by stating everyone is doing bills like this across the nation and maximizes rewards by emphasizing the cutting edge and leadership role New York could take. So the final political performance that I want to examine today is CUOMO's December 21, 2018 press release announcing the signing of the Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights. The press releases are carefully crafted pieces of political performance and often contain points of reception as well. This press release represents a certain jockeying for credit between the governor and the legislative sponsors. The press release's headline reads, quote, "Governor Cuomo establishes Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights," end quote. And after a brief description of the law, Cuomo is quoted as saying, "As the federal government shamefully ignores the voices of sexual assault survivors, New York is doing everything in our power to empower survivors and ensure they are treated with dignity and respect. This legislation will support our work to combat the scourge of sexual harassment and assault and help deliver justice to survivors and make New York a safer state for all." Again, Cuomo positions himself opposite the Trump administration and as a national player, indirectly invoking the recent Kavanaugh hearings, which took place a couple months prior. He also signals ongoing commitment to survivors, but Simotis, on the other hand, continues to emphasize bipartisanship and collaboration. Quote, "This is a great day that puts in place a missing protection for sexual assault survivors and bringing more compassion to law enforcement response to survivors. I'm thankful to Governor Cuomo for enacting this new law, to the advocates whose dedication and collaboration brought this about, and to Kemp Hannon, my colleague in the state Senate who sponsored the bill in that house. I'm proud that we could all work together for such an important cause," end quote. So this stands in stark contrast to a press release she published a few days prior, publicly shaming the governor for not having signed it yet, calling it quote unquote languishing legislation. The end of the governor's press release contains quotes from Amanda Wenz, Rise's founder, Ilse Knecht from the press conference, and Selena Bennett Chambers of NYSCASA, or the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Each of the carefully crafted quotes boosts New York's image as a national leader and as a responsive institution. These instances of political performance demonstrate how advocates frame policies as posing low risk and high reward for state actors in the context of the MeToo movement. The Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights represents an ongoing movement to mobilize survivors as a political constituency. This legislation precedes the 2020 Survivors Agenda Summit, which seeks to strategically leverage survivorship into a political power base in order to create a system that centers survivor needs. Importantly, the Survivors Agenda looks to restorative justice practices and wonders what might lie beyond the state. My dissertation adds a new look at an old issue. How do advocates and state actors leverage the moment to enact social change? While the Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights Act has some limitations, this case study adds a qualitatively valuable contribution to the field. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary, for that fantastic talk. It was wonderful. And I can't think of research that's more timely right now. I want to open the floor to questions, but as we're waiting for that, and just, you can raise your hand or in the chat box, pose your question. If you want to unmute yourself, feel free to do so. While we're waiting for questions, I wanted to point to the elephant in the room, which is the fact that CUOMO himself now has been accused by at least six women of sexual assault, that some of these protocols that he has supported and put into place are now being implemented against him. Could you address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I was talking to Gwen a couple of weeks ago, and it seems like this just kind of dropped into my lap, right, as I'm, working on the dissertation. And so, in some ways, it's such an interesting case study, and just contrasting it with, other instances where state actors have been held accountable, like thinking about Al Franken and Eric Schneiderman, where they were forced to resign at least. But CUOMO is very clear that his intention is not to resign, right? And I think that it's, one of my study participants, we were talking about the sexual harassment that was endemic within the legislature in Albany, especially in the case of Vito Lopez, from the late 90s, early 2000s and stuff. And so she was talking about how powerful institutions protect themselves, right? And the governor's office in New York is a powerful institution, regardless of who's occupying it at the given moment and stuff. So I still don't have clearly formulated thoughts about it, because I do think that some of these policies are steps in the right direction, but I also don't think he's the one that should be getting credit for it either. Right. And I also think about the concept of rape insurance, right, which is a concept that, rapists or abusers will cultivate a cult of personality around them, that, oh, so-and-so could never do this, right? Like, look at all these things he's doing for women's rights. Like, look at all these things he's doing for survivors. So he couldn't possibly be part of the problem. And so I think that that's something that we see kind of again and again, like at the Kavanaugh hearings, like, oh, he's such a great dad to his girls and stuff like that. And he mentors women law clerks and stuff like that. So kind of the ways that those discourses get mobilized in these cases, at least I find that very interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you. I hadn't heard of that phrase rape insurance before, but it certainly illustrates it well. Jessica, go ahead.
Thanks so much for sharing your awesome, amazing work with us, Hilary. So when you were showing us your slide where you were kind of breaking down the Victims' Bill of Rights, my question was, we can talk about accountability with politicians and big institutions, but when we look at the widespread breakdown about how the Bill of Rights affects smaller institutions across a grander, a bigger place, how is accountability, if I don't know if you'll know this, but how do you, do we have any feedback about how accountability is being handled? So what are the actual measures of accountability? When you say you have to follow this and victims need to be presented with their rights, who is following up on this? How is there any kind of insurance? I was going to say who enforces it, and then I'm like, oh, that could be a problematic kind of way of framing it too. But how are we ensuring accountability with making sure that this Bill of Rights is actually presented to people?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Jessica. I think, especially when we think about the state, the issue of accountability is really important, because to whom is the state accountable, right? And that's where we kind of get more into the biopolitical sphere of it. But in terms of the very technical, who is responsible? It depends, right? Because the Department of Health regulates the SAFE programs, the sexual assault forensic examination programs, of which there's only 46 in the state. Only 46 hospitals have a designated safe program, and then the rest do telemedicine with those other 46 programs and stuff. So so if the sexual assault nurse examiners or SANEs are the ones that where the victim has first contact, then they're supposed to be accountable. But if they go to the police are supposed to be accountable. And on background, the only reservation that people had, or any kind of constituency had about this legislation, was the police, because in earlier drafts of the bill, they were the ones on the hook 100% for making sure that these survivors got their Bill of Rights in writing and stuff. And so they kind of wanted to spread the accountability around a little bit. And then it also did just make sense to wherever your first encounter is, that's where you should, have your rights said to you. I was with an event with Judith Olin the other day, and she said anecdotally she's heard in Erie County that this isn't happening consistently and stuff. So as of April 1st, the Department of Criminal Justice Services now has taken over all long-term rape kit storage in a centralized facilities. And so that decreases the burdens on hospitals in terms of their storage, but not really on the personnel side of really making sure that these victims know their rights, that they're delivered in a culturally competent way, and stuff like the Bill of Rights, which I can throw in the chat as a PDF. It is offered in multiple languages and stuff, but it doesn't mean that there's not lapses, right? Part of why Arabella Simotis publicly shamed the governor prior to his signing was because a news story broke that 5 hospitals in New York were discovered charging for sexual assault exams, when that is a violation of both the state law. Well, it wasn't a state law yet, but it is a violation of VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, and VOCA, the Victim of Crime Act, and stuff. So I think the question of accountability is an ongoing one. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Jessica. Kathleen.
Hilary, thank you so much. This is wonderful. I think so. As someone who does sexual assault research, this is enlightening for me, because honestly, I didn't know that much about this bill. And one of the things that I find very concerning is how few sane nurses there actually are, and particularly in rural areas. For instance, I know that particularly in indigenous communities, there's very few sane nurses and very little access to sane nurses. And so my question to you is, when we look at things like this, a bill of rights, how many other states do you even know are adopting things like this? Because the comment is, from a federal perspective, it doesn't really mean much because it only relates to federal cases. How many other states are adopting Bill of Rights like this? Do you know?
Yeah, so as of 2020, the National Conference of State Legislatures identified 12 states that had at least some form of one, and then RISE, their whole organization has changed to focus away from the Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights to helping people do their own legislation on whatever they're passionate about. So they are also doing a lot of work on gun violence legislation and things like that. But the last time that they published anything on their website, they said that they were working in 41 states and stuff. So I did try to go through individually each of the states, but I couldn't quite find them because, again, one of my participants said that, all of these regulations were kind of here, but they were in different parts, right? Some of them were in, codes related to the Department of Criminal Justice Services, some were in criminal codes, some were in victim Office of Victim Services regulations. Some of them were in Department of Health. And so because they were so scattered across different codes, they weren't actually being implemented to their intended effect. And so this was an effort to kind of centralize it and increase, victims' opportunities to learn about their rights. So it is just such a common sense piece of legislation. Again, it's like really low risk. Nobody wants to be the one that says, I don't care about sexual assault. I'm not, that's not my thing, right? That doesn't matter, right? No politician is really going to survive that, right? And we see that with politicians that are just like, why didn't you just close your legs? Right? We had those kind of instances that immediately kind of tank their careers. Although now, in the age of Matt Gaetz and others, I think political careers are much more resilient now in some ways that are not great.
Thank you. Michael, then Susan, and then Ellen.
Thanks a lot. And thanks a lot, Hilary. This was really interesting, especially from my perspective as a lawyer. I'd like to hear more about how you conceive the relationship, or how you just define high risk and low reward, right? I'm sorry, excuse me, low risk, high reward, right? In the sense that it seems like it's somewhat circular. The thing that makes it low risk is that it's popular, right? That it will play well, right? And it seems like I'm kind of interested to know or hear any examples of high risk policy or legislation, recently at least, with respect to sexual assault. And some of these things are really quite major, I think. I think even this, you characterize the Bill of Rights legislation as narrow, but it's, I'm not sure that it is. Especially the advocate, the guaranteed advocate who guides you through the process. That's a really kind of major and special sort of innovation. Like the lifting of any statute of limitations, that's huge, right? Now, in a somewhat different context, right? The coercive control legislation in the domestic violence arena, right? That's like a really kind of innovative way of conceiving of a criminal offense. And so, and these things are extremely popular and extremely, at a substantive level, really significant. They represent, great changes both from the status quo as to sexual assault, but also from the status quo as to criminal law generally. So I'd like to hear more about what is high risk here,
Yeah, I think thank you so much, Michael, for that question. I think that's really an important question. And I think, for me, the answer to that is partisanship is what creates risk, right? And stuff. So you think of things like the Reproductive Health Act, the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, the Child Victims Act, all of these were kind of languishing legislation under partisanship because it's, abortion is a hot button issue, right? The Child Victims Act had, powerful constituencies lobbying against it, right? And the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act really changed some of the judicial policies, right? Like the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, if you are unaware, for folks in the room, it gives judges leeway to be lenient in sentencing if a person commits a crime as a direct result of experiencing abuse, right? And so, but where that hits on the ground is that proving that it was a direct result of the abuse, right? And so what I think generates high risk is that I will kind of push back. I do think it is narrow, right? Very impactful, but the scope of the actual policies that it changed, like I said, it didn't change a lot. It just centralized it in one location. Whereas these other bills drastically changed the codes, right? Drastically changed how we interact with survivors, how we interact with women's health issues, right? In these very politicized ways, right? And stuff. So I think, like, you know, one of my participants who is an expert on the bill said that, you know, again, nobody wants to be against this bill called the Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights. But she said, if you actually like changed anything about, you know, penalties, about criminal investigative processes, right? If you like actually change something substantive, she said, quote, you're gonna have people picking up their heads going, wait, I don't care what this is called, this is gonna have major consequences, right? And so I think that's where I envision risk. And I think risk shifts over time. It shifts for different politicians, right? Like I think Susan Collins, and, you know, just to go back to the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, I think that she's someone that can manage political performance and manage risk very well, right? And part of that is like, you know, she's repeatedly called very well suited to her state, where she's kind of no nonsense and, you know, willing to compromise sometimes, but it's just, you know, really not going to stick her neck out very much in either direction, right? And so I do think that it is narrow in the sense of what it changes, but not on the impact that it can have. I think that there's a huge impact that it can have. So thank you for that. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Susan Kahn.
Hi, thanks for a wonderful talk, Hilary. And I'm so glad I finally know what you're working on. I have a question about activists and the relationship to the state, because early in the women's anti-rape movement in the 70s, there was a real reluctance to fully engage with the state because of its role in law enforcement and a general distrust. And I'm wondering, you know, but if you want to change laws and legislation, you have to engage with the state. So I'm just wondering, over the course of your research, if you found any among activists sort of reservations about, or what their thinking was on how to engage with the state, and if your own view of activism and the relationship between, you know, grassroots activism and state politics changed.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what kind of first started my interest in this area of sexual assault research is that, you know, despite being skeptical of the state, I found that, like, at least in the narrative that, like, I've figured across different eras of different feminist scholarship on rape, is that regardless, feminists kind of locked into the state, that this is where we adjudicate sexual assault, this is where we adjudicate harm, this is where, you know, we seek recognition from the state. In ways that are, you know, in some ways anti-feminist, right? Like we think about carcerality and the carceral state. And if we're, you know, going to be intersectional, if we're going to think about that, we have to critically examine the state. But at the same time, I feel like we're kind of locked in, right? Because like you said, if we do want things to change, we have to engage the state and stuff. So I was thinking, like, in terms of how I'm thinking about it, just going again back to the like biopolitical state, the state has different relationships to different people, right? Like, so recognizing myself as a white, middle-class, well-educated person, right? Like I have a very different relationship to the state than, say, Indigenous people experiencing settler colonialism, Black people experiencing police brutality, right? Like, so there are the ways in which that our identities and our, you know, social positioning changes our relationship to the state. And so one of my favorite quotes was from an Indigenous activist that I interviewed. And she said, with regard to the state, my approach, quote, my approach has always been to move on without them, the state. You know, it's like, how many years have we been expecting something different from somebody who is continuously giving you the same response? And it's like the typical abusive relationship, right? It's the power and control wheels to the nines, except it's with an entity. And so for those of you who might not know, the power and control wheel is like the different tactics and cycles of abuse that abusers use in order to keep their victims trapped in an abuse cycle. And so I found that really fascinating, that this person is framing the state as an abusive partner that is creating a dependency, right? Like we're dependent on the state to recognize us, to, you know, address our needs and our instances of harm or experiences of harm. But it's also one of those factors in us experiencing that harm, right? And so I think that the other activists that I've talked to, and again, just the Survivors Agenda Summit that I didn't get to talk about very much, like it is moving towards a restorative justice model, but even that model still expects something from the state in terms of like victims' compensation or managing victims' compensation between abusers and victims, right? So I think that there's no shortage of being critical of the state, but I also am just like, I don't see a way out of it.
Thank you, Susan, for that question. Ellen. Ellen, I believe you're on mute.
Okay, this was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for making it available to those of us who are even in other states. I'm trying to reconcile one point. About 10 years ago, there was a lot of media coverage about the thousands and thousands of rape kits that were languishing, particularly in certain municipalities. And there were high-profile cases of serial rapists whose DNA was in some of those rape kits that were never processed and who continued to rape other women. And I'm just trying to reconcile that fact with the need to have legislation that would ensure that the rape kits are not destroyed after 30 days.
Yeah, so that's a point of shame that activists were able to leverage, that New York had the shortest window in the entire country. And part of that End the Backlog campaign that was also started by the Joyful Heart Foundation and stuff. So, you know, if you're going to go through this, like, you know, hopefully this won't be like triggering for anybody, but if you are going to go through this arduous hours-long exam, right, and you know, the legislation also calls for survivors to be seen within 60 minutes of arriving in the hospital, where before they could languish there for hours waiting to be seen by a qualified nurse and stuff. So yeah, it is shocking that this was something that received so much attention back then, but this one really critical piece of the unassigned kits, right? So if you turned your kid over to police right away, you're good, right? But if you needed time to think about it, you only had 30 days, right? And that wasn't made publicly aware to survivors going through those kits. And so now they have a centralized location for unassigned kits in central New York and stuff. But yeah, it's just like, we're a country that really likes to think we care about assault, but we really don't put a lot of our policy there, right? We don't put a lot of our money there to end the rape kit backlog, to provide services, right? And so it looks really great when we do. But thank you so much for the question. I hope that I answered it.
So the legislation is only a partial solution because the assigned rape kits can languish for years. That's what you're saying right now, basically.
Well, they won't be destroyed now. So they won't be like tested, or they will be tested, and the survivors know if it like matches any DNA and stuff, but they don't really have to go through a criminal investigation. You know, there's a study in Canada in 2018, and I couldn't find a comparable one for the United States, sexual assault victims that went to a hospitals in Canada, only 31% agreed to have the rape kit done, and only 14% agreed to turn it over to the police. So we know, like, that's where I'm thinking about the limitations of this bill, is that not every survivor goes through the rape kit because it is an arduous, invasive, you know, terrifying exam and stuff. So we know that not every survivor will choose to go that route and stuff. And then from there, not everyone will choose to go the criminal justice system route.
Thank you. Other questions? Corinne, did you have your hand up or? Oh, okay.
I'll be getting some emails from the committee afterward.
Hilary, you know, in answering Ellen's question, I was thinking about other countries, and you mentioned Canada. What are, for you, really positive examples that countries that are doing this right at the national level? Do you have a point of comparison?
No, I mean, I'm not a comparative political science person and stuff, but I don't really see, I know that the Sexual Assault Survivors Bill of Rights is on the books in Japan, Canada, and I believe Kenya and stuff. So I know that those countries, like, it went international for a couple of years, but I don't really see, you know, I don't really see any countries that are hitting it out of the park, right? Because again, I think that the biopolitical state is just like, it's not super interested in this issue, right? And in some ways, like, it incentivizes sexual violence, right? When we think about, like, you know, police brutality, Daniel Holtzclaw, right, who was a police officer who targeted marginalized Black women for sexual assault while he was on the job, right? We think about state actors that abuse their position within the state to abuse people, right? Or we think about ICE and Border Patrol, you know, and the thousands of child sexual abuse victims that reported sexual abuse while in detention, right? So we think about the ways in which sometimes the state can benefit biopolitically from sexual violence. But that's kind of one part where I don't have that fully fleshed out and stuff. So this is why, you know, again, I don't want it to get away from me and stuff. So I just focus more on the technical policy aspect. But I do think that there is important biopolitical conversations to be had.
Very good. Other questions or comments?
Cody?
Oh, Cody, go.
Yeah, hi, Hilary. I mean, just to echo everybody, thanks so much for a fantastic talk. This was really amazing. And I think my question kind of continues on from the one that Susan asked, which is, I'm always struck in this sort of work, and especially like on your slides, there was the quote that was like really like, this is the least that New York can do, right? And that so often seems to be the dynamic, right? Like it's really the least that can be done. And yet, as you so aptly put it too, like that doesn't mean that it can't have good effects, you know, but it's so often that like there's just years of work poured into just sort of accomplishing the least, doing sort of the bare minimum, and that's so often the dynamic between activists and institutions, whether that be governments or universities or whatever, right? And I'm curious, in your case studies, if you've seen any changes happening in that dynamic, like any sort of more direct collaborations happening or opportunities for that between activists and legislatures, where like it could maybe get to a point where it's not the least, or yeah, or is that just sort of the insurmountable, like, you know, big institutions or big ships that turn slowly and it's going to be the least?
Yeah, I think you're right on point with that. So thank you for that question. When I was talking to participants, especially advocate participants, they would say, like, you know, they would frame their relationship with the state as one of like positive contention, right? We're like, we're partners in this, we both want the same things, but here's like, you know, one of my participants, they said, well, here's your policy though, right? Like when they were thinking about how to be more responsive to LGBTQ survivors in the Department of Criminal Justice Services, right? And so part of it was like, well, this is your policy though. You don't have, you know, proper gender markers on your forms, right? Like you have really exclusionary practices and stuff. So this particular advocate framed their relationship to the state as one of like education because the desire is there, right? And then another legislator talked about working in bipartisanship, right? Is that like my friends across the aisle have the best intentions, but we need to find where we can overlap and work together. So it's this very like collaborative contention, I think, between advocates and state actors, because I think, you know, I don't know anybody, I didn't meet any single bureaucrat when I was in Albany that didn't have the best of intentions, but the intentions are not necessarily what translates on the ground. Did that answer your question, Cody?
It did. Thank you, Hilary.
Cody. Anyone else for a final question? Is hitting the top of the hour. Well, Hilary, this is incredibly powerful material, fantastic presentation, and such a timely dissertation. I'm really, really pleased that we had this FRA where you could share your work. And it's been wonderful to see all of you, and a number of you are from all parts of the country. Ellen, I know you're in Boston. Hilary's family from the Pacific Northwest joining us today. And
Gabby from Lebanon.
Lebanon, from Lebanon is here. So it's wonderful that we can all meet via Zoom. One of the real benefits, even though some of us have real Zoom fatigue, this is really one of the highlights of it, and I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your wonderful questions. They're giving me a lot to think about. And just thank you so much for everybody from Corrine and Gwen and Gabby and Susan and Carrie and Cody and Jessica and Michael and Kathleen, especially, who have given me mentorship over the last few years. It means so much to me that you are here. And I am very, very grateful to share some of my ongoing revision research.
Very good. Well,